So let me add my welcomes to Mike's earlier remarks and welcome you to one of my many houses. The Presidential Library System was created by Franklin Roosevelt shortly after he created the National Archives. His library was the first of the 13, and at the dedication of that library, he articulated his vision, a vision which has guided my entire agency from its earlier days. He said, to bring together the records of the past and house them in buildings where they will be preserved for the use of women and men in the future, a nation must believe in three things. It must believe in the past, it must believe in the future, it must, above all, believe in the capacity of its own people so to learn from the past that they can gain in judgment to create their own future. Collecting, protecting, and encouraging the use of the records of our country has been our mission from the beginning, and I'm very proud to report that this administration's open government focus on transparency has resulted in an unprecedented level of access to previously classified material. To cite just a couple of examples, the December 2009 executive order which created the National Declassification Center at the National Archives with a mandate to review by the end of 2013 for declassification a backlog of some 352 million pages dating back to World War I. The 6 oldest records were World War I era formulas for invisible ink, declassified by the CIA. Thank you. The initial review was completed on time. Half have been through complete processing with a 62% declassification rate. More importantly, our indexing on demand approach, where requesters ask for certain series, has completed 239 projects, totaling 8 million pages with an 80% declassification rate. The best news is the review process created will prevent future backlog scenarios. And according to the most recent report of our Information Security Oversight Office, the production of new national security secrets fell significantly over the past 5 years. 52,000 new secrets were created in 2015. That may sound like a lot, but 258,000 were created in 2005. Steve Aftergood, in his Security News reports, the data appear to confirm that the national security classification is undergoing a slow motion process of transformation involving continuing incremental reductions in the classification activity and gradually increased disclosure. In line with this increased disclosure, today's program marks the second in a series of historic releases consistent with the openness theme. The Presidential Daily Brief has been closely guarded and in great demand since they were created during the Kennedy administration. I know there are lots of individuals in the chain that made this possible, but I want to publicly acknowledge Joe Lambert for his collaboration and partnership during my tenure as archivist. He has truly embodied the slogan of our National Declassification Center, releasing all we can, protecting what we must. Thanks, Joe, for making that happen. Having an advance copy of today's release, I've had an opportunity to dip in and relive some of our history through the lens of the Daily Brief. I went immediately to 5 March 1970, the day I reported to the 1st Medical Battalion, 1st Marine Division in Da Nang, a Navy hospital corpsman, my first day in country. Not that I expected to see my name prominently announced in the Presidential Daily Brief, but I was curious about what was going on. Related to Vietnam, and the principal developments of that day: Soviet Jews backed the USSR's Middle East policy, Libyan troops are coming back from Egypt, an entirely redacted report on Jordan, and short notes on Guatemala and Venezuela. Not a mention of Vietnam, or Laos, or Cambodia that day, but plenty later in that month and year. But enough about me. I now have the honor of introducing today's panel of experts who will address the importance of these records. Your program has detailed biographies, which I won't read, but briefly, our moderator is Gregory Treverton, who, since the fall of 2014, chairs the National Intelligence Council. The Council supports Director Clapper in his role as head of the intelligence community. It was created in 1979 to serve as a bridge between the intelligence and policy communities, a source of deep substantive expertise on intelligence issues, and a facilitator of intelligence community collaboration and outreach. Dr. Treverton served as a policy analyst and director of the Center for Global Risk and Security at the Rand Corporation. In addition to his many Rand publications, is the author of Reshaping National Intelligence for an Age of Information. Our distinguished panel of historians includes David Robarge, the chief historian of the Central Intelligence Agency. He's published both classified and unclassified works on the CIA's supersonic A-12 reconnaissance aircraft and intelligence in the American Revolution. Erin Mahan is the chief historian in the Office of the Secretary of State and the author of Kennedy, de Gaulle, in Western Europe. Stephen Randolph is the historian for the Department of State and author of Powerful and Brutal Weapons, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Easter Offensive. And David Sargent is Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Berkeley, and the author of A Superpower Transformed, the Remaking of American Foreign Relations in the 1970s. And in the spirit of true disclosure, Steve and Erin serve on the National Historic Publications and Records Commission of the National Archives, which I chair. So it's nice to see you here.
Thanks very much, David. It's for me a great honor and a pleasure to be here. As someone who's been outside government and outside intelligence more than I've been inside, though this is my fourth time on the inside, that's probably plenty. I've been struck by how, shall we say, ungood the intelligence community is at explaining what it does to the American people. Too often we leave it to the Edward Snowdens to do so for us, and that's not a good idea. So gatherings like this I find particularly welcome, and I want to add my thanks to both the archives, the foundation, and the library, as well as the CIA for making this possible. I had the privilege before I took my current position, when I was still at Rand, to speak at an earlier gathering here and on an earlier release. This was when the CIA released a bunch of documents pertaining to the 1973 war, and that was also a wonderful occasion, I think a great occasion for transparency. So I applaud that in line with Director Clapper's transparency initiative. The more of this we can do, I think, the better. Not only do we provide too much fodder for graduate student PhDs, let us hope we also provide some grist for people who want to understand a bit better what we do. David has saved me the pleasant task of introducing the panel, so I won't. Let me just say it's wonderful to have a trifecta of distinguished government historians plus a distinguished academic who's thought about these issues. I want to turn quickly to them, and I hope we can keep this very conversational, but I thought I might just frame the panel in light of what I thought was really a very interesting conversation between Jim and John. We know the PDB has changed a lot over time and could evolve in the future. It began life as the PICKLE. Washington's wonderful for acronyms, isn't it? That was the President's Intelligence Checklist. It was a note card the President could put in his pocket, just a reminder of what intelligence he'd gotten that particular day, so he wouldn't be confused by reading the same thing twice or not knowing where something had come from. So it's gone from that modest beginning to now what is really a very substantial operation. And that makes us think about how it might evolve in the future. We want to focus very much on the Nixon-Ford administration. That is our particular focus for today. But I was struck, I had the opportunity again before I took this job to look for the Center for the Study of Intelligence at how subsequent administrations to these, specifically the three administrations before Mr. Obama's, had dealt with the President's Daily Brief. And I had good oral histories that CSI, the Center for Study of Intelligence, had done. And what struck me about those oral histories is the senior officials that testified on the point all liked the PDBs, but they all liked the briefers better. because the briefers were an introduction, an entree to a conversation. They could ask questions, they could get more information. A reminder that while we focus on the PDBs as documents, intelligence is really about process, not about points. It's not about did we get it right in this particular paper, though we always hope we do. It's about the process over time. Indeed, the CIA has a wonderful study of intelligence successes, though in fashion typical to our community, it's classified, right? Because it talks about the various intelligence analyses. What it makes clear, these successes make clear, was that the successes resulted not from a sparkling single analysis, but from a process over time, where intelligence analysts could better understand what policy people needed, and policy people could calibrate and direct to some extent what the intelligence analysts would work on. So it is a process, and I think raises two questions that were themes of this morning. One is you can imagine lots of possible ways we in intelligence could support presidents daily. And so the question is, what is the best way? And in particular, how best to manage that balance between immediately tactical, reporting information, and more strategic thinking. My role at the NIC, National Intelligence Council, is meant to be very strategic. We are dominated by current intelligence, and so our challenge too is trying to think, how do we get the balance right between current immediate sort of tactical support and more strategic analysis? That I think then raises a second, more general issue as we look to the future, and that is, what is the future of relations between intelligence and policy in a digital age? The famous dumb iPad came up earlier, but soon policy seniors, including presidents, are going to want not a dumb iPad, but a live iPad so that they can have a 24/7 conversation with their intelligence analysts. Already my Australian counterpart says his prime minister is very disappointed in him because the prime minister gets up in the morning, gets on his PDA and starts talking to all his cabinet ministers, but he can't talk to intelligence. He has to wait and go to some special room. Well, this I think is going to change, but it'll be interesting to think about those future developments in light of this rich history we're going to discuss right now. So I will go in the order of the program. David Robarge, the Chief Historian for CIA. David.
This event mirroring the PDBs of Nixon and Ford give us an excellent opportunity to underscore an important point about the relationship between Central Intelligence, the PDB process, and the White House, which is that it's entirely up to the President how it is going to be run. There is nothing in the National Security Act of 1947 setting up CIA and the National Security Council that says the intelligence process will be a certain type. It is strictly up to the President. Whether he is interested in intelligence, thinks it's important, wants to use it, has biases against us, considers it irrelevant, has other sources, that's entirely up to him. And the extent to which the agency over the years, and now the DNI in collaboration with the agency and the other community elements, has tried to tailor the daily product to meet the President's needs is a fascinating story. And you can see by scanning through the documents in today's release how the PDB itself as a product changed. But behind the scenes there is an important story about, as Dr. Treverton says, the process, whether presidents wanted briefings, how they integrated the PDB into their intelligence flow, who managed the intelligence flow. And more importantly, I think, ultimately, is what the agency tried to do to strike the balance between what the agency thought it needs to tell the President and what the President wants to hear from the agency. And they certainly are not the two same things by any stretch. And today we have the opportunity to look at two very different presidents running very different intelligence processes. I would refer to Richard Nixon as a hostile audience, and I would refer to Gerald Ford as an eager consumer. And you could hardly take two juxtapositions more starkly. Nixon's well-documented distrust of the agency and intelligence is long established, and we don't need to get into it there. But just as a mirror of what the agency was getting into, during the transition period when Nixon had set up his headquarters in New York City, the agency headquarters wired intelligence up to our outpost there. We called it DDI New York at the time. And this included PDBs, analytic products, and such. When the operation up there closed down just before the inauguration, all of those items were returned to us in envelopes that had never been opened before. The point here is that Henry Kissinger, as he said, wanted to make sure that no agency had particular entree to President-elect Nixon. He, Kissinger, wanted to control all of the intelligence flow, and he didn't want the agency, in effect, trying to sell itself as the premier actor in the intelligence community. He also had a number of complaints about the PDB as a document. Literarily, he thought the style of it was elliptical, the articles were too brief, the coverage was spotty, it didn't get to the key issues. He once referred to an article on Panama as a worry for an assistant secretary of state, not the president of the United States. And he also wanted to change the whole daily process of the PDB arrival. Previously, as the pickle and the PDB, it would arrive in the morning. For a brief time, Johnson got it in the afternoon, but then he changed it to the morning because he wanted to get it while he was reading the newspapers and watching the morning TV shows. Kissinger, as an indication of how he was going to control everything, said, I want the PDB delivered to me in the afternoon so I can mix it together with all the other intelligence I collect from the White House Situation Room and other sources, and then I will put it together into a morning briefing for the president and give it to him myself. So an important point here is that we have no morning briefing, and we didn't have one until Gerald Ford, which I'll get to in a little bit. Interestingly, also, Kissinger said that Nixon wanted the PDB to go to John Mitchell, the Attorney General. Now, this had nothing to do with domestic law enforcement or terrorism or anything of the sort. It's because Mitchell was a political advisor to Nixon, and Kissinger thought it would be useful for Mitchell to be able to advise the president on the political implications of some of the foreign events. Also, Mitchell told Kissinger that Nixon is a lawyer and he wants facts and analysis separated. He wants the facts first and then the analysis second. Previously, they had been somewhat integrated in the structure of the articles. So now, as you go through the PDBs, when you look at them tonight, you will see the structure of the articles is very much just the facts, and then the analysis. This even went so far later on that the agency thought maybe we should highlight those by distinguishing them typographically. So you had italics used for analysis and regular font used for the so-called main facts of the story. Also, the PDB is restructured from the one Johnson had, and I would suggest you go back to the previous release and do a comparison to see how the structure changes. It would be divided up into major developments, other important developments, and annexes in a very structured format, and specifically just to suit Nixon's proclivity for writing on legal pads, the document suddenly became legal-sized. And a few weeks into the process, it developed a top binding, so he could flip it over just like a big legal pad. This is an example of how the agency historically has tried to proactively, in a sense, tailor the product itself to presidential needs. The look, the feel, the delivery times, all of that has changed. Now, the circulation for the document itself is entirely up to the president. Now, in the case of Johnson, he had it delivered to 10 people by the time he left office. Nixon cut that way back to 6, and then he gradually expanded it up to about 9. And sometimes in the PDB's history, it's gone to as many as 2.5 dozen individuals outside the immediate circle. And in other cases, it's been very, very close held, again, entirely up to the president. The key point here from the relationship perspective, though, is that the PDB under Nixon lost its standalone quality. It was no longer the thing that went to the president each morning, albeit by delivery from the CIA and with a discussion between the president and the national security advisor, or just the president reading it himself. The way Kissinger ran the intelligence process here is that he would take that document, let it sit for effectively 12 hours, constantly updating it with Situation Room material and other traffic, and then prepare in the morning a national security memo that he, Kissinger, took to the president for a one-on-one briefing. CIA is completely out of the picture, and none of those individual items in the presidential security memo was tagged specifically to the PDB. So in effect, right at the start of the administration, we are largely read out of the process documentarily. We're also read out of the process in feedback, because there is no continual back and forth between the White House and CIA. As one of Kissinger's aides, Andrew Marshall, said, "Your and the president's work style do not lend themselves to feedback," meaning you like to go in the Oval Office, slam the door shut, cook up something, and then spring it on the policy community. CIA is not involved there. You're not telling them what you want in the book. You're just sort of taking it as it comes and going from there. So as a result, the PDB is growing ever more useless over time in the Nixon administration. And the DCI's presence is completely lacking too. Nixon was not interested in dealing with the DCIs. The National Security Council meetings at which the intelligence briefing would be provided becomes less important over the Nixon 2 terms. He had no relationship whatsoever with William Colby, who became DCI in 1973, and much of that relationship is very quickly superseded by the looming impeachment. Now, what the agency tried to do in response to a request from Bob Haldeman, who did get involved with the process a bit, was kind of recraft the PDB a bit. But instead of recrafting the document itself, what was cooked up was something called the Presidential Intelligence Précis. Now, you will see a few of those in the released documents. Regrettably, they're entirely redacted, obviously, for some sensitivity of sources and methods, even at this late date. But the key here was to, again, try to make the document relative, respond to what the president wanted. Needless to say, it didn't work. It only lasted about 10 months, and pretty soon the whole relationship just becomes superseded by the Watergate scandal and the looming impeachment. Onto the scene comes Gerald Ford, the eager consumer. And here you have a sort of a night and day change. Respect and receptivity replace distrust and hostility, in effect. And Henry Kissinger's control over the intelligence flow diminishes significantly. Now, this goes back to the time when Ford was vice president. He already had some working knowledge of CIA current intelligence products, especially the PDB, because he had been introduced to them when Bill Colby gave him a tour of CIA headquarters and mentioned the PDB. Ford asked to see it. Colby showed it to him, and Ford said, "I want to see this if I become president." Well, of course, he becomes president, and he immediately says, "I want a daily briefing. I want the PDB front and center. I want one of your people in my Oval Office talking to me about the document, having that conversation." And Kissinger, needless to say, wasn't too thrilled about this idea, but he remembered who he worked for, and Ford said, "We're going to have the briefings whether you like it or not." What you find here is an interesting change in the whole atmospheric of the process. Nowadays, and for the many years in the past, including when I started as an analyst over a quarter century ago, feeding the PDB was the be-all and end-all of the agency. And hundreds and hundreds of people in the building every day would get constantly spun up about putting something in the PDB, responding to presidential taskings, getting the book down there, responding to the taskings, and doing it all again 7 days a week, with one exception: it wasn't done on Sundays. This tempo is so different from what it was back then, when, for example, JFK would get the pickle in the morning, maybe look at it, stuff it in his coat pocket, pick it up during the day, glance through it. Johnson, similarly, you've seen the famous picture of him reading it to his grandchild before bed. Those kinds of things. It's a very, very different atmosphere. What you're starting to see here with Ford is this tempo change. And the reason being is that the briefer is there at the White House. He's in daily communication with the Situation Room. After he leaves the briefing, he goes to the Situation Room, tips them off on what the president was interested in, so the sit room can watch for that over the next 24 hours and inform the CIA about what it's picking up. Meanwhile, CIA is taking back taskings to the headquarters. The analysts are getting spun up about it, filling the book, and it goes back to the White House in this kind of symbiotic relationship. Now, this is unprecedented in the history of the PDB, and it's exactly what CIA likes, because it's getting immediate response to its premier presidential product. As you look through the documents, you'll also see that the format of the Ford book changes a bit. It retains the same legal size, But after the initial effort by CIA to present longer essays and inform the president about events he might not have been familiar with, it backs off, creates more focused, shorter pieces. It does include explanatory annexes and longer essays, mainly for upcoming events or as summaries of national intelligence estimates. Now, this ends relatively drastically in November of 1975, when, with the campaign coming up for 76, the White House staff, and it's now Rumsfeld and Cheney, decides the president needs to spend less time on intelligence and more on winning the election. So they say to Ford, we think you ought to cut back on the daily briefing. Just get the book delivered to you by Brent Scowcroft, the national security advisor who had replaced Kissinger as that role. Kissinger was still Secretary of State. And then the president will just read the book, talk to Brent about it. Brent will get back to us if he has anything to say, and that's the feedback. Again, the DCI is not involved with this. Colby stayed out of the daily production process, as did DCI Bush when he becomes DCI in 1976. This is not good for the agency, and we are ultimately dissatisfied with it, but of course we work for the president and we have to go by his preferences in this process. But as Dave Peterson, the briefer, writes, and you can see his excellent essay in the back of your booklet, there is no substitute for direct access. Indirect feedback, filtered and interpreted by others, leaves us, CIA, ill-informed and unsure. And to sum it all up, and then I'll turn it over to our substantive experts who will talk about the contents of the PDB itself and its policy implications, John Helgerson writes in his great book, Getting to Know the President, ironically, it would not be until George Bush himself was in the Oval Office, remember he's DCI at the time, that CIA would again establish with a president a working relationship as fruitful as the one it had enjoyed during the first half of the Ford presidency. So please look through the documents. They're educational, they're fascinating in substantive terms. Look for them as signals of the relationship between CIA and the White House, which is one of the most important relationships inside the U.S. government. And I'll turn it over to my colleagues now. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And next is Erin Mahan, the Chief Historian of the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Erin.
Good afternoon. I'm honored to join this distinguished panel of historians, and I wish to thank the CIA and the Nixon Library for their invitation. Dr. Robarge has provided an excellent overview of how the PDB and briefing process worked under Presidents Nixon and Ford. In my limited time, I'd like to offer some observations and insights into the use of the PDB specifically and intelligence generally within the Department of Defense during the Nixon administration. Former Wisconsin Congressman Melvin Laird was Secretary of Defense during all 4 years of Nixon's first term. And initially, Laird was only one of 4 recipients of the PDB outside the White House. A courier would arrive each morning to deliver the current PDB and pick up the previous day's edition. Laird's senior military assistant, Lieutenant General Robert Pursley, described the Secretary's interest in and use of the PDB as akin to browsing the magazine Reader's Digest. Now, the more erudite amongst us might see that as pejorative. But given that Laird became senior counsel for international affairs at Reader's Digest upon leaving the Pentagon in 1973, well, that suggests that Pursley's analogy might actually be regarded as praise, albeit somewhat faint. So every morning, Pursley, if not Laird himself, would peruse the PDB and look for items of interest. And in late 1970, Laird indeed asked DCI Richard Helms to expand DoD's readership of the PDB to include Deputy Secretary David Packard. Yet this request stemmed not from a belief that the PDB was indispensable, but rather from Laird's operating philosophy of participatory management. He shared almost everything with his deputy and promised never to exclude him, which can be interpreted fairly as a rebuke of the management style of Henry Kissinger, Laird's chief rival within the administration. Neither Laird nor his senior military assistant ever noted a single instance when the PDB factored into a DoD decision, much less served a determinative a determinative role. Laird was generally underwhelmed by the daily report. He believed the PDB lacked, quote, intensity, and the secretary never saw fit to alert the president because of something he had read in the PDB. My own extensive transcription of Nixon's presidential recordings supports the notion that the PDB did not make waves. Still, the fact that nothing in the PDB elicited phone calls to or from Nixon, whereas media reports, usually leaks, and cables did provoke the president, perhaps speaks volumes about the purity of the daily brief and the CIA's ability to avoid it becoming politicized. Laird's assessment of the PDB as the Intelligence Reader's Digest should not be mistaken, however, as lack of appreciation for the value of intelligence. Quite the opposite, in fact. Laird always sought a larger universe of intel from which he could draw, wanting as much intelligence on as many topics from as many sources as possible. To characterize Laird's use of intelligence, let me give a brief sketch of what I call the 3 A's: acquisition, analysis, and application. With respect to the first step, probably the most apt description of Laird's use of intelligence is ubiquitous, in a way that was quite unusual in the Nixon administration. The SecDef acquired information from a wide variety of sources, not only from executive agencies, but also from Congress and the media. For instance, Laird, who had earned great respect as a congressman before agreeing to become Nixon's Secretary of Defense, continued to cultivate his former colleagues on the Hill, walking up and down the hallways and meeting with them socially, so he had the pulse of what Congress knew. Likewise, he had the ear of the media. He trusted them, and they trusted him. They recognized his propensity for openness, often in refreshing contrast to the White House, a fact that often annoyed Kissinger and the president. Laird's affable, inclusive, and non-threatening manner served him well. He could be ubiquitous and relentless in intelligence gathering without appearing to trample on others' terrain. He enjoyed a special rapport with DCI Helms, with whom he lunched or had breakfast regularly. In fact, it was Laird who insisted and prevailed upon a reluctant Nixon to permit Helms to attend NSC meetings in at least a briefer capacity. And these would be the only channel for regular presidential briefings by the DCI during Nixon's tenure, owing to the president's aloof style and hard feelings toward the agency, which Dr. Robarge just addressed. Laird also moved well beyond the PDB contents and asked for a twice-a-week special briefing by a CIA officer. The SecDef, in addition, brought together all elements of DoD intelligence, so each knew what the other was doing. And at least every other Friday, Laird convened an intelligence breakfast, which included Helms, as well as the heads of all the DoD components. And earlier today, we heard about how much more inclusive the PDB and intelligence process is. But I want to provide the historical context here, where we remember the PDB was a CIA product alone. So it was Laird's intention to broaden the universe and to seek other avenues of intel. So at these intelligence breakfasts, he included all the heads of the DoD components, and Air Force Undersecretary John McLucas also attended because he secretly served as the head of the National Reconnaissance Office, the agency that dealt with satellite imagery and whose mission was considered so sensitive at the time that even its name and initials were classified. Lastly, Laird met twice a week directly with the heads of the Defense Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency, Generals Don Bennett and Admiral Noel Gaylor, both of whom he appointed and both of whom he promised 4-star status if they proved loyal by giving him the intelligence first. With this universe of intelligence sources, Laird achieved his objective of staying astride, if not one step, of Henry Kissinger and the White House. Of equal importance, the Secretary acquired the hardest intelligence possible for military operations. So with regard to the second step, my second A, analysis, Laird typically followed the dictum, never believe the first report, be skeptical about the second, and question the third. He was always cautious about single reports from intelligence agencies. It made no difference whether it came from CIA, DIA, or the military service branches. An early crisis in the administration, the April 1969 downing by North Korea of an EC-121 reconnaissance plane, which carried 6 tons of electronic eavesdropping hardware, illustrates Laird's cautionary approach and lends insight into the intersection of policy, politics, and intelligence in the Nixon administration. The president regarded the downing of an unarmed, unescorted plane and the death of its 31-member crew as an intentional hostile action that required a swift reprisal. Laird's first order, however, was to immediately suspend all U.S. reconnaissance globally until the Pentagon could figure out if such flights were critical and or whether armed escorts were now required. This action made so much sense to Laird that he didn't even think it necessary to inform the president or discuss it in any detail. The White House, meanwhile, pressed the Pentagon to draw up options for retaliation, and the NSC began deliberations. Soon the SecDef learned from intelligence sources, though not the PDB, which throughout the 2-week or 3-week crisis really provided bland, usually single-paragraph summaries. Laird learned from other sources that a single nervous North Korean pilot who had not sought approval up his chain of command was responsible for the EC-121 shootdown, making the episode something other than a deliberate act of war. Laird also learned that the recon mission near North Korea had intel value but was hardly critical. These pieces of information dampened his own enthusiasm for retaliation, but not Nixon's, even when the president learned the facts. The SecDef saw little military value and great risk in a retaliatory strike. Logistic resources and theater were insufficient to prosecute the war in Vietnam and modernize the South Vietnamese army, and simultaneously to incite a possible conflict in Korea. While delaying Nixon's desire to resume recon flights, Laird ordered military commands, the NSA and DIA, to evaluate the risk and benefits of worldwide airborne reconnaissance, the frequency of the necessary missions, and whether protection was needed. Kissinger informed the president that Laird's actions effectively delayed the resumption of reconnaissance and therefore contravened the president's stated policy. To neutralize Laird's delaying tactics, Nixon decided that the 303 Committee, an interagency body that included the National Security Advisor, but not the Secretary of Defense, would take over from DoD the review of worldwide reconnaissance operations, in addition to its usual task of overseeing covert operations. There were essentially 2 other significant consequences from this episode. As Kissinger writes in his memoirs, Nixon decided he would never trust Laird or Secretary of State Rogers, who had sided with Laird, again. Nixon would, quote, get rid of Rogers and Laird at the earliest opportunity. He would never consult them again in a crisis. Now, that didn't happen soon, but the second consequence did. Frustrated by the lack of timely retaliation against North Korea, Nixon turned his attention to Southeast Asia and ordered another secret round of bombing in Cambodia against North Vietnamese forces stationed there. So to conclude, it's hazardous, of course, to extrapolate from one episode and make grand pronouncements about the intelligence-policy relationship. But I do think it reminds us of the complexities involved when we talk about the outcomes from intelligence delivered to policymakers, whether it arrived in the form of PDBs, NIEs, or other reporting. The same intel informed a variety of policymakers in different ways. It cannot be divorced from their prejudices and goals, personalities, as well as personal and institutional rivalries and interest. In short, the human factor. It's difficult to envision anyone save a Melvin Laird, a SecDef comfortable in Washington and in his own skin, hunkering down and deftly using intelligence to outmaneuver the president and his national security advisor. The PDBs, we are reminded, are just one element in the perpetual struggle to give policymakers the intel they need rather than what they prefer to seek and absorb. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next is Stephen Randolph, who has a wonderful title, The Historian of the State Department. Though I think he's not the only historian in the State Department.
No, but I'm in charge of all the rest. And it's the greatest gig ever. And let me start by thanking actually the Nixon Library, not just for hosting this event, but for their work in preserving and opening the record of this remarkable administration that we've been talking about today. I've been doing research into the Nixon material for about 15 years now. It just never gets old and you never get enough. It is truly magnificent. As well, I'd like to thank the CIA, Joe, and all of the people who helped put this together and run the declassification processes that are integral to this magnificent release. And I'm proud to work with you guys in the core work of our office in publishing the Foreign Relations of the United States series, and glad to reciprocate in playing kind of a supporting role in this event today. My research strategy and preparation for these remarks was to examine the material around the key moments in Nixon's management of the Vietnam War and to see where the documents took me, to see what the historiographical value of this material is on release. And I found myself, as I read this material, oscillating among three different perspectives as I viewed the material, perhaps proving again that we are all prisoners of our past. As a historian of the State Department, I was reading this with an eye toward, first, in a kind of an immature way, how we would have used it had it been available when we were actually documenting the Nixon administration. But I got in touch with my inner adult and decided that the important issue is sort of the relationship of this material to the material that we've already published on that administration. As a historian of the Nixon's Vietnam War, for a second perspective, I was looking to see what these documents add to what is known and understood of that time. And as a former professor of national security strategy at the National Defense University, I was looking at the nature of the intelligence provided to senior leaders and the relationship between the intelligence community and the policymakers, which has been touched on by others. With respect to the Foreign Relations series, just to give a little context, my office is responsible under law for publishing the official documentary record of American foreign relations. And for the Nixon-Ford administration, we have published about 60 volumes of primary material, the primary documents, which is about 40% more documentation than we have published on any other administration in history. And this is a mark of, I think, two things. One, the drama and the importance of the events of those times, and secondly, the richness of the documentary record. Generally speaking, our material that we have published, and I encourage you to go to our website at history.state.gov and find it there, it's all online. Our material and these PDBs complement each other in important ways. We focus by law and by policy on the policy deliberations that lead to the definition of policy, to include the alternatives to the policies that are in the end decided. And we use the intelligence community's documentation in a very important way to see how that informed the policy process. But by definition, at this level, we are not, in the Nixon administration, would not have printed the kind of material that most of this material is. It's more tactical, it's reporting more or less at the ground level. It's very much, I think, a reflection of the relationship, again, of Nixon and the intelligence community at the time. Very conservative, I think, in the reporting. But the material is very important in one regard, in that, or actually in many regards, because they are precedent to and resulting from, in many cases, the policy deliberations that we document. And so there's this complementary relationship that I think will be extremely valuable to academics and students of foreign relations far into the future. As our work with the policy process, the PDBs provide kind of the headline news of the events in any given spot. And there's a lot more information that they do not cover, again, as is natural, but they provide a narrative backbone to the events of these times that is of immeasurable value. With respect to the historiography of the war, I find value of different types, as a matter of fact, in each of the major episodes of Nixon's leadership, based on the historiography, the nature of the documentation, and again, the relationship at the time between the president and the intelligence community. It is first of value, and this is very important, in measuring the extent to which this war was a constant burden on that administration. From day one, when Nixon swore the oath of office, until the very end, the Vietnam War was the primary concern for him most days. About 60% of the PDBs include some reference to the war in Indochina. Conversely, the PDBs provide a very important remedy to the historian's normal assumption that the events he is he or she is studying are the only ones of concern to the policymaker, right? You know, I care about Vietnam, therefore Nixon needed to care about Vietnam. What they do is provide perspective and a context to the place of Vietnam in the broader policy and the broader concerns of the administration. Very important in that respect. With respect to the specific value in the different major episodes, when you look at the material from the Cambodian incursion, which is right after David got over there, started in April of 1970, what you see is a clear progressive narrative in the PDBs which provide a very welcome clarity on very much confused events over time. I didn't see anything that really, again, radically changes the interpretation, although I will say that one of the most interesting aspects of reading that documentation was in the week prior to Nixon's decision to send the Americans and South Vietnamese into Cambodia, because the PDBs reflect events on the ground in Cambodia in that period and have a very kind of a cool, distant perspective. They don't view any real crisis going on there, but Nixon is getting his primary intelligence from other sources, to be specific, I think the military and from Kissinger. And as was mentioned by our panel earlier, he gets to choose what he believes and who he listens to, and made the decision to send the troops into Cambodia. There's a different value, I think, in the material looking at the end of America's war in Vietnam, the end of 1972, early 1973, where most of the historiographical attention has been paid to the Christmas bombing, the endgame negotiations between Kissinger and Le Duc Tho. But what you find in these PDBs is a record of the preparations of the two Vietnamese parties for the post-war environment, or at least the environment after America departs the war. Because what you find there is that, again, President Thieu in Saigon is restructuring his political system. The North Vietnamese are rearranging their command structure around Saigon. There are 200 tanks coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail during the Christmas bombing. And overall, you get the sense that none of these parties actually expect peace to break out over the land. There's one other segment that I looked at with some care, actually, from the Ford administration now. It's that period of time in March and April of 1975 when the final North Vietnamese offensive overthrew the government in Saigon, ended the war. And General Clapper, I think, mentioned that this morning. And I will say that it reflects very much this change in the relationship between the policy community and the CIA of that time, because every single day through this period of time is a major essay by the CIA on the political and the military events, the plans of the contestants, much more fulsome than anything I had seen in the Nixon administration, very much an expression of I think, of that changed relationship that David spoke of earlier. With respect to the intelligence policy interface, I think actually the most striking sequence I found was in the incursion into Laos in early 1971. In fact, General Clapper was there at the time, which is interesting enough. So obviously it wasn't that long ago. It's come down through history of the code name of Lamson 719. And let me give you a brief sketch of the backstory here. And this one is worth paying attention to because it ends up in a defeat. And it's one of these fairly common examples. You know, you can't really talk about your successes because often they're things that don't happen. It's when things go wrong that you find something to learn. So after the incursion into Cambodia in April and May of 1970, the North Vietnamese convened their strategic planners and their military and did a strategic estimate of the situation. And they projected out that having gone into Cambodia, the next inevitable action would be for the Americans and the South Vietnamese to go into Laos. And they projected not only that the next movement would be into Laos, but exactly where, in fact, it would happen, which is along a one-lane dirt road called Route 9, going kind of intersecting the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And based on that projection, they proceeded to structure a command structure to manage their response to that kind of an operation. They built a road network to support reinforcement into that area. They built a logistics infrastructure. They had the commanders in the area doing terrain walks, familiarizing themselves specifically with the terrain that the operation would be occurring in, and they deployed AAA units into that area. All of this is months before the American leadership had even begun contemplating such an operation. I mean, it is really like a kind of a startling piece of strategic planning on their part. The Nixon administration decided, starting in December of 1970, with final approval actually in late January of 71, to execute a theater-wide offensive. The offensive into Laos was only one arm. There was a second major arm in Cambodia. There were special ops off the North Vietnamese coast, and there was an air offensive. And this is all, again, back to something General Clapper mentioned this morning. When he went there and he saw that number of how many Americans were still there, 340,000, they weren't going to be there in the next dry season, right? If there's going to be a major American action in Southeast Asia, it has to be then, because the withdrawal is proceeding so quickly that this is the last major chance. So this was a big roll of the dice for the Americans and the South Vietnamese. Kissinger viewed it as prelude to a major diplomatic effort to try to offer generous terms to end the war in 1971. Having heard the sort of preparatory remarks, given this extreme asymmetry, as was mentioned in the earlier panel about the information, the careful planning of the North Vietnamese and this fairly rapid compressed decision-making cycle by the Americans and the South Vietnamese, you can project a bad outcome, and that's exactly what happened. The South Vietnamese entered into Laos in early February. Within 4 days after the start of the operation, the PDB notes that strong counterattacks appear imminent. Intercepts indicate coordinated tank and infantry attacks. And if I had been, I think, cognitive and in Southeast Asia at the time, I would have thought, tanks? North Vietnamese? What? I mean, this is a completely different picture than what anybody was carrying of their adversary at the time. 2 days later, the PDB expects, quote, a stronger stand by the NVA, even though fighting at that point is still light and sporadic. 2 weeks later, though, there's kind of the climatic document in this whole series. It says, evidence is mounting that Hanoi will attempt to inflict a major setback on the South Vietnamese army in Laos, even if the cost proves high. The North Vietnamese have moved substantial forces into the area, and they seem to have shelved the cautious style of fighting that has been their hallmark for most of the last 2 years. So this is a completely different adversary than what everybody had pictured going into that operation. Nonetheless, the White House, especially Kissinger, insisted that the South Vietnamese prolong their stay in Laos as long as possible and try to extend their stay into April for really 2 reasons. One is, of course, the domestic political impact of a rapid retreat from Laos. And secondly, I think, to support this diplomatic initiative that he had planned. But the South Vietnamese basically broke under the counteroffensive by the North Vietnamese and conducted a disorderly retreat into South Vietnam. The operation ended on March the 23rd. And I think the sequence is worth looking at for several reasons. First of all, it indicates that there are multiple channels reaching the decision makers. In this particular case, the PDB was just one small voice in this volume of information that's getting to the White House. And in fact, the primary reporting channel to Kissinger emerged out of MACV in Southeast Asia. It ran from the 3-star commander serving with the South Vietnamese during the incursion, went down to MACV in Saigon, up to Admiral Moore as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and then to Secretary Laird, and thence to Kissinger. And it's remarkable to look at these ongoing reports, because there's this inveterate optimism that is this can-do attitude that's a core part of the military mindset, but they keep thinking that bad as things were today, they're going to get better tomorrow, and they just kind of kept that report repeatedly for the duration of the operation. The second thing that I think we pick up from this is the difficulty in picking out the key information from all the noise in the policy process. I mean, the stuff was in the PDBs, and if you could hear the small, still voice of these warnings of this new kind of enemy that they've resolved to win this battle at any price, it changes your perspective, I think, in how you decide with respect to that operation. The third thing, though, and it was referred to frequently, is that intelligence feeding into the policymaker is important, but you're trying in this particular case, for example, to overcome the policymakers' perspectives and their objectives. Kissinger is intent on sustaining this operation as long as possible and proceeding with this diplomatic setting and preventing this domestic damage. And it was very hard to get him to realize that this is not the operation that he had expected to find. The fourth, I think, is that the image of the enemy that we had forged over long years in Southeast Asia was no longer valid. We had no concept that they would show up with heavy artillery and tanks in that area. And finally, at some point, I mean, the February 27th PDB that I read the excerpt from was about 3.5 weeks before the end of the operation. But by that point, the North Vietnamese had so clamped in the South Vietnamese force that there was nothing practical, in fact, that could be done from the White House. There's a point at which you can no longer affect events. So again, I think it's important to focus on this, among other things, because it shows us, first of all, that it's so important to get this right. This whole effort on the PDB is to inform the policymaker to avoid these kinds of outcomes. And a big part of what was discussed earlier today was this fusion, where you don't have a separate channel coming up through the military and a different one through intel channels where they basically block each other out. And so once again, I'd like to thank all of those involved in this conference today for giving us the opportunity to think seriously about these subjects.
Batting cleanup is Daniel Sargent from University of California, Berkeley, and I hope we will save at least a few minutes for your questions. We may have demonstrated how difficult it is for people who know a lot about subjects to be brief in discussing what they know. Daniel.
Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of today's event, especially Celia Mansfield. It is an honor to be included among the participants, and I am grateful for the opportunity to speak. While I came here to talk about the documents that the CIA is releasing today, I hope that you will indulge me just a few words on my own scholarship so that you will better understand the perspective that I have to offer. About 18 months ago, I published a book titled A Superpower Transformed: The Remaking of American Foreign Relations in the 1970s. The core questions that this book engages have to do, in some basic sense, with the relationship between intelligence and policy. The book asks how leaders in the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administrations both perceived and responded to large-scale structural changes in the international system they inhabited. Insofar as my own conclusions have been inscribed in print, it was with some trepidation that I began to read the PDBs that have been released today. After all, these documents represent a large body of evidence that I did not have opportunity to consult, and I worried about how they might subvert the conclusions that I had reached. While I am glad to report that the documents have not debunked my core hypotheses, at least not in my evaluation, I will gladly attest that the PDBs have enriched, enhanced, and expanded my understanding of the world in which Presidents Nixon and Ford operated. Taken as a whole, what the PDBs for 1969 to 1977 offer is a view of the world as the President of the United States saw it, albeit a view mediated at times by the National Security Advisor. This vantage is crucial, I believe, for understanding the history of presidential decision-making. To grasp why Richard Nixon chose as he did, we should attempt to see the world as he saw it. No set of documents will suffice, of course, to give us this perspective, for worldview is always and necessarily an achievement of the individual psyche, being the result of a lifetime's experiences and learning. Still, it is the intelligence agencies of the United States government that provide the real-time information upon which real-world decisions are predicated, and that shape, as much as any information flow, the evolution of presidential assumptions about the world. The great value then for historians in the newly released PDBs is that we can now encounter at least part of the information flow that informed key foreign policy choices of the 1970s. We can now encounter the world as Nixon and Ford engaged it. Unsurprisingly, the PDBs provide expanded context for understanding key foreign policy decisions and choices. Here, two examples may prove illustrative. First, the PDBs provide vital context for understanding Nixon's opening to China. The substance of what the documents have to tell us is unsurprising. Relations between China and the Soviet Union in the early 1970s were dismal. What is impressive, however, is the intensity and frequency with which that point is made. In the PDBs for 1969 and 1970, the cleavage between the Soviet Union and China appears not as a distant sideshow, but as a defining feature of world politics. Now, that fact has important implications for how historians understand Nixon's choices. Read alongside the PDBs, Nixon's engagement with Beijing may appear somewhat less original than many historians render it. Contextualized, the famous China opening may appear more a response to changes that were already underway in the international system than a revolutionary innovation that created new realities and changed the course of the Cold War. In this case, then, the PDBs may dampen the luster of Nixon's accomplishments. Yet in other cases, the documents may help to chasten and restrain Nixon's critics. Here, Laos and Cambodia are suggestive cases. In critical accounts, these countries are routinely described as neutral states into which Richard Nixon expanded the Vietnam War. Such assessments, the PDBs suggest, risk distorting the landscape of choice as decision-makers encountered it. In the CIA's daily briefings, after all, Laos and Cambodia appear not as neutral bystanders to the Vietnam War, but as decisive terrain in the War for Indochina, a pan-regional conflict in which communist insurgents frequently appear to be gaining the upper hand. The travails of Laos and Cambodia appear in over 1/3 of the PDBs that are being released today. This is remarkable. Across the entire series of documents, Indochina receives about twice as much attention as does Europe. Historians who read these documents will learn that Nixon was, almost on a daily basis, more likely than not to read about the violent inroads that communist forces were making in Cambodia and Laos. This knowledge may or may not exculpate Nixon's choices, but it should enable historians to empathize and to achieve fuller understanding of why the administration acted as it did. Having reflected on what historians might gain from the PDBs, I will turn to a question that Dr. Treverton posed in our preliminary conversations about this panel. How might intelligence analysts make their advice to policymakers more strategic in nature? This is a crucial question, and it reverberates with my own interests in how decision makers understand long-term processes of historical change. I'm going to offer 2 quick points, both of which I will frame in relation to the PDBs that are being released today. My first point has to do with the relation of ends to means, or purposes to capacities. This seems to me an area in which specific institutional characteristics of the United States government may inhibit the formulation of strategic intelligence. In particular, the bureaucratic demarcation between foreign and domestic agencies may discourage the CIA and other national security agencies from engaging with the domestic variables that are, in the end, determinative of America's capacity to act in the world. The PDBs for 1969 to 1977 illustrate the point. Discussion of domestic politics is almost absent from these documents, despite the tumult of Watergate and the domestic insurgency against détente, both of which severely afflicted foreign policy in the mid-1970s. In economic matters, the PDBs feature some discussion of international monetary affairs, but the documents make almost no mention of vast structural changes in the American economy, from deindustrialization to the rise of Silicon Valley, changes that proved transformative for the exercise of American power in the larger world. While formal demarcations between foreign and domestic arenas of responsibility exist for very good reasons, we should, I think, be mindful of how the omission of domestic material may limit the intelligence community's capacity to furnish strategic intelligence. Strategy, after all, has to do with the relation between ends and means, and the means that sustain American power are, for the most part, domestic in origin. My second concluding point has to do with how intelligence analysts situate particular events in relation to larger-scale processes of historical change. On this point, I am happy to engage as a historian, for what historians do, after all, is to posit connections between phenomena so as to organize evidence within the explanatory frameworks that establish causation and meaning. The challenge for those who advise presidents is presumably to provide sufficient context for establishing causal connection while deferring to the interpretive judgment of elected officials and their appointees. For the most part, the PDBs for 1969 to 1977 managed to strike this balance. For sure, the documents sometimes read as a rapid-fire succession of events, perhaps recalling Elbert Hubbard's famous remark about life being one damn thing after another. At the same time, the analytical annexes that are appended to many of the reports do help to situate specific developments within broader historical contexts. Still, I am drawn to wonder whether the PDBs could have been more forthright in critiquing some of the implicit historical assumptions that shaped U.S. foreign policy in the 1970s and that often pervade the documents themselves. Reading across the PDBs, it is difficult to avoid the impression that what really matters in the world of the 1970s is the Soviet-American Cold War. Other major international dilemmas, such as energy and the associated global recession, are at most secondary. In this respect, the PDBs can only have reinforced Nixon's own intuitive Cold War centrism, his foundational assumption that what really mattered in world politics was the triangular relationship between the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. More explicit engagement with parallel and simultaneous developments in world affairs, from the early stirrings of economic globalization to the assertion of the post-colonial countries, might have encouraged White House decision-makers to take a more expansive view of the challenges facing U.S. foreign policy in the 1970s. By highlighting processes beyond the Cold War, including political, economic, and even ecological upheavals at the global scale, intelligence professionals could have unsettled stable assumptions about the world and perhaps encouraged decision-makers to contemplate alternative vantages on the tasks facing U.S. foreign policy. The PDBs, in short, might have done more to unsettle static worldviews. Still, I will in conclusion concede Henry Kissinger's famous point. High office provides sparse opportunity for renewing and revitalizing intellectual capital. The White House is not an environment that is conducive to sustained reflection, reevaluation, and reconsiderations. At the same time, these are vital cognitive functions that some organ of state ought to be performing, for without ongoing reassessment of what is happening in the world, of what matters in the world, foreign policy will lack an adaptive strategic rudder. Here, the CIA presumably has a vital intellectual role to play today as much as in the 1970s. Thank you.
We do have a few minutes for questions. We have a microphone. Please try and be as brief as you can and perhaps suggest which of the panelists you'd like particularly to speak to your question. In the back there? Okay.
Thank you. Kudos to the panel. What a wonderful discussion amongst agency historians. I can't let this opportunity go by with the U.S. archivist here and everyone planning for the President Obama's presidential library. I'm curious whether agency historians have been asked or tasked with the prospect of what records, what papers in your own agencies might be included in President Obama's library. From my standpoint as a consumer of presidential libraries, if I were to go to a presidential library, I might be mistaken in my belief that all decisions regarding the administration may lie in that library. Point in fact might be during the Bush administration, TJAG, for example, in the Army, was tasked with making enormous decisions regarding Abu Ghraib, regarding interrogation, torture, and other factors that greatly influenced our foreign policy during that period.
Anyone want to respond? David, do you want to say a word on this subject? I mean, the answer is much more documentation than anybody can process. It takes years to process and very, very difficult to deal with, but it is voluminous. David.
So the short answer is there are two sets of laws that govern the records. There's the Federal Records Act and the Presidential Records Act. On the federal side, these historians here represent agencies which are governed by the Federal Records Act, which means they create record schedules, They decide which records have long-term value and are going to be transferred at the appropriate time to the National Archives. Selective, long-term historic or legal value. Those are the criteria by which those decisions are made. That's the Federal Records Act. Presidential Records Act is very different. It's everything. It's everything. Much easier, simpler to deal with. All the records that are created in the White House become record of the country. And that's what ends up at the presidential libraries. Now, the decision-making crosses lines. Those federal agencies support the work of the White House, but there's a separation in terms of the records themselves.
Okay. Thank you for your interesting presentation. You mentioned the shoot down of the reconnaissance aircraft. What was the PDB for the Pueblo, which occurred in that relative time frame? And also, and probably less thought of in that time, but mentioned in the 1990s, the shoot downs of reconnaissance aircraft over Siberia, which were numerous.
Well, I guess
Erin, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I'll address first. Initially, the PDB gave reportage from North Korea, where the North Korean government did compare the EC-121 shoot-down to the Pueblo. But it was, again, the PDB was very cursory in its treatment and in any kind of parallel or comparison. I don't want to punt the question entirely, but Dr. Robarge, who may be more familiar with the PDBs from the Johnson administration, might be able to amplify my response.
You had mentioned an incident in the 1990s? Oh. Well, I can't speak to unreleased PDBs or what's in them yet. We'll have to wait until that time frame rolls around when they can be released. So, can't answer your question, I'm sorry.
Next question to your right.
Yes, I want to know, was President Ford the first president that really had daily briefings with a CIA analyst who would deliver the daily briefings?
David,
Yes,
you wanna take
yes,
that?
definitely.
Yeah.
David Peterson, as he describes in the article there, was tasked to brief him when he was vice president at Bill Colby's permission, and then he wanted that continued after he became president. Prior to that, you had no daily briefing by a CIA officer. You would have, in the Kennedy administration, delivery of the document frequently by a senior agency officer, but effectively he was an overpaid courier. He was not engaged in a daily briefing or anything of that sort. Sometimes he would hang around in case a question came up right after the document was delivered, principally if the National Security Advisor had wanted some clarification that he could then pass on to the president. But beyond that, you don't have anything until 1974 with Peterson and Ford.
The two administrations we're looking at are, as several observed, a really striking contrast in intelligence policy relations. One distant and distrustful, the other close and integrated. What strikes me is, in the current circumstance, by comparison to my last stint in government nearly 20 years ago in the Clinton administration, is intelligence policy relations are so much closer and tighter. Intelligence is so much more embedded in the process than it was 20 years ago, perhaps mostly because we've been fighting wars for the last 15 years, and I sometimes quip that, unfortunately, you can make policy toward China without intelligence, but you can't very well fight wars without intelligence. In any case, the contrast of these two administrations we're looking at today is really quite striking and instructive.
Third row from the back, center section.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. The current PDPs are put together as described by many groups. Do you know, or has anyone said how much it costs to put it together?
Let me, as I said something about that, I guess I'm the only person that, well, everybody probably sees the PDB. I get my iPad every morning and read it. I think of it as probably the most expensively published, now it's no longer a book, but it was a book, it was probably the most expensively published book since Gutenberg. It is an enormous endeavor. We've seen times when it was one person, Dave Peterson, when it was a checklist, but now it still really dominates the analytic side of the CIA that is responsible for most of the basic drafting, though it is very much an interagency process. And because it's an interagency process, which I think probably does have the advantages that Jim Clapper mentioned, it means that often it'll take 6 hours to write a piece and 3 days to coordinate it, to get it coordinated across all the various agencies. So it is, the opportunity cost of it in its current form is really quite large. Again, the judgment is if consumer number one really likes it, and that's what he wants, maybe she wants one day, then we'll do it. But it is worth noting that from my perspective, the opportunity cost in terms of things we don't do because there's such a focus on the PDB is really quite large.
My question is addressed to Professor Sargent, and it deals with the U.S.-Canadian relationship. Why is it that Nixon fails, in the papers that are here, fails to recognize the global implications of dealing, Trudeau was one thing, but in Canada overall, very dismissive, seeing as unimportant. Why doesn't he understand the global implications of that?
Great, that's a challenging question. I would posit in response that Nixon may not be exceptional in his disregard for Canada among American presidents. I mean, the U.S.-Canadian relationship is presently in a halcyon phase because of the rapport between the head of state and head of government. But I would suggest that the present situation is unusually warm.
It reminds you of the famous line, the Canadian line, that the United States is our best friend, whether we like it or not. Maybe we have time for one more. Perhaps the woman over here.
We've got one more over here.
Is the vice president briefed? It sounded like Ford took a tour of the CIA and found out about the briefings. Was he not being briefed during the Nixon administration?
David?
No, he was not. Initially, the vice president was not receiving the PDB during the Nixon administration. He was later added to the distro list. Ford was not receiving it at that time when he became, when he was appointed to vice president. And it was only, as you say, only when he went to the agency and got this tour from Bill Colby that he found out about it and began to be briefed. Again, it's entirely up to the president who he wishes to put on the distribution list. The initial pickle went to 3 people. It went to John F. Kennedy, McGeorge Bundy, and DCI John McCone. That was it. And it was entirely up to the president whether to expand the distro list or not. As I mentioned earlier, it's sometimes been as many as 24 plus. Sometimes it's been very, very tightly held, like both Bushes.
Yes, mostly yes.
Yeah, they did. Nelson Rockefeller, when he became vice president under Gerald Ford, did receive the PDB. The process there was interesting, trying to find time for the briefings. They decided to agree on a sort of a drive-in briefing in which the briefer would sit in the back of the limo with the NID, the National Intelligence Daily, the PDB, any other things that he thought the vice president was interested in. This is a standard process, by the way, with busy Washington seniors, is that you often will meet them at their houses and brief them on their way into the office. A number of them prefer it that way because they want to get it done during the downtime of the commute, and then they can show up at their offices knowledgeable about what the president has read himself or will read, and that becomes increasingly a dynamic in the PDB process. And you see this definitely in listening from policymakers in the Reagan, Clinton, and beyond Bush administrations, is that they read it not so much because they're interested in it, because it's the president's going to read it, and they want to use it as a kind of a baseline for knowledge throughout the policy workday. And as mentioned earlier by Dr. Treverton, a lot of times it's the briefing that's the most important, the relationship that develops between the principal and the briefer. the ability to bond, the ability to provide clarification and feedback and a tasking flow. That's a crucial element of it. As a fundamental point, the briefer has proven to be more important than the document itself, I think.
Please join me in thanking the panel for their insightful comments. We've had a number of senior officers from across the government that joined us today that supported the event, and I want to thank them. We had, in particular at CIA, we had the head of our new Directorate of Digital Innovation with us, our Chief Data Officer, our Chief Information Officer, and others from the White House, from the National Security Council that are here, from NSA, from state, and others. Thank you very much for your support of this event. This pretty much concludes the event. I have 3 tokens of CIA's appreciation that I'd like to hand out. And Megan, if you could help me, please. If I could ask Mr. Elsie to come to the stage, please. These are crystal awards that just essentially thank the Nixon Presidential Library for their extraordinary support for today's event. If I could invite the President and CEO of the Nixon Foundation, Bill Barabaugh, to the stage. Bill, thank you for your help and for making this wonderful venue available. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. And lastly, Jim Hughes from the Association of Former Intelligence Officers. If you could come up, please. AFIO is a huge supporter of all these events we do all across the country. So, Jim, thank you very much. This concludes our event today. Thank you very much for attending. I hope you have safe travels home.